Such a pleasure for us to host the session on behalf of Electrum. It's really nice to see a lot of people coming to the session. I'm personally excited for this session. We're talking about card a little bit. I just told Gabriel that I actually haven't attended a seminar on card payments in a while. So I'm really excited about this session. So this is all about card innovation in payments. And I'm delighted to welcome Gabriel Swanepoel to the stage. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Everybody hear me okay? So this is no pressure at all. I mean, I think I know more than half the room, so it almost feels like an open crit session. So hopefully I do tell you something that you haven't considered in detail before, that we haven't spoken about in the last 6 months. But very excited to be here. It's such an interesting time to be in payments. I think we're at the cusp of significant change. Some of those changes have occurred already. And the world of card, has been around for 50 years and is strongly positioned in some markets from an emerging economies perspective. I think we all know that there are plenty of white space, especially in Africa. And so the question has to be asked, what is the future of card innovation and how do we see the landscape moving forward? And more importantly, what are the roles of the different stakeholders within the broader ecosystem? And how does it impact the way that we're going to work through things? So the title of the presentation today is The Next Economy. And the reason we titled it The Next Economy is because, in a sense, payments in the way that it was is not going to be the way that it's going to be positioned in future. I think that what we need to be aware of is that there are certain macro trends that have fundamentally changed the way that we think about payments today, and that ultimately is going to shape the way that payments becomes part of a broader value story or part of a broader ecosystem moving forward. And so what I'm going to talk through today are 3 drivers, really. Actually, I skipped one over here. I'm going to talk about 3 drivers that's at a very high level affecting the way that we think about the trends that affect payments holistically. And I think the first thing to think about is that from a digital commerce perspective, the world has moved on quite significantly and at pace following the pandemic. So in South Africa, we know that the e-commerce growth grew by more than 60% during the 2022 time period. And at the back of that, there was also a rise in contactless payments within the card space, both of whose trends actually stayed congruent post-pandemic. So we had a little bit of a slowdown in terms of point of sale usage initially on a temporary basis as people return to cash transactions. But in a very fundamental way, we've seen that trend continue. So one of the things that is important to call out, and a little bit of a throwaway comment, but at the end of March 2021, South Africa was sitting at roughly about 600,000 odd point of sale devices on card. And since then, up until the end of July this year, that number has now grown to 1.6 million. And so from an acceptance locations perspective, we'll talk about that moving forward, but there's definitely a commoditization happening on the acceptance side of the house, and people are starting to become more comfortable with digital or electronic payment, and it's starting to enter and encroach on spaces which we haven't seen before. So it's important from a utility perspective, but I'll return to that part of the conversation a little bit later. I think the second point is to raise is the rise of alternative payment methods. And this has been clear across Africa with the rise of mobile money in excess of 300 odd million accounts on a 30-day basis across the continent, and able to reach where bank accounts and cards, quite frankly, you never could. And so those alternative payment methods initially was to exploit use cases like domestic money transfer in a way that included people within the broader digital economy. But what's starting to emerge is that the whole theme or thematic around wallets are becoming a lot more involved, and the way that that's coming together as part of driving adoption within that space is also evolving. And so the proliferation of payment methods and an understanding of how digital wallets, the role of digital wallets and what they're going to play going forward is critical and key. And then I think lastly is in terms of regulation. Now I just saw before we started the session, there's that Electrum did a little thing where some of the regulatory headlights were called out, and notable Two notable ones of them is probably the introduction of Vision 2025, but also the broader modernization of the payment system in South Africa. And this is not unique to South Africa at all. I think that in the beginning of this year, just from a MasterCard point of view, across Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we had more than 18 projects that is focused around broader payment modernization, revision of regulation, broadening of the participation of the different ecosystem stakeholders. And even in the way that we see bigger, larger corporates set themselves up, it is clear that payments are becoming an enabler where it is not the primary driver for monetization as part of the business case, but rather an enabler, either to capture data in order to provide value-added services, or as a mechanism to provide efficiencies within a use case that has got absolutely nothing to do with payments at all. And so it is absolutely critical to understand what the aspects around regulation will be on the way that we think about payment systems moving forward. But the trends aren't the only important things. Equally important is an understanding of how these trends should be interpreted. And the way that we thought about talking through it today, and when my team and I started working through the detail of what we wanted to share with you, I think the only way that we could realistically organize this in 40 minutes, and I think it's not exhaustive at all, but we'll give it a shot, is to think about the reimagination of money and the components around the exchange of value. So how do we think about value exchange? What is the principles or the foundational departure points around value exchange, and where's that heading? Secondly, around intelligent experiences. So there's lots of talk out there. There's things happening within the metaverse. There's new channels. There's new experiences that's starting to become part and parcel of the way that people are thinking through the articulation of propositions within different segments. But how does that really come together from a payments perspective? And lastly, from a sustainable futures point of view, how do we do this in a responsible way? And what is the impact around corporates now from both a social and environmental perspective? And how should we think about the way that we relate to the industries that we operate in, but importantly also the geographies that we work in? And how do we make sure that those things that is important within the local environments or countries that we operate in translates into the way that we provide services? Because ultimately that is becoming important for the younger generations that's starting to come through. And so if those three trends that I spoke about over here then can be organized into these three changes that we think is going to be transformative in the card payment space, then the topics that we need to talk about that I'm going to fly through today, but happy to talk about afterwards, can be articulated through these 9 blocks. And I think the first one that's important to call out is under the reimagination of money is really the understanding of how do we think about the three things. The first one is, are the form factors or the channels going to be the same? So how do we think about credentials? Secondly, how do we think about payments in itself? So will a payment in the past equal a payment in the future, and the way that it comes together? And lastly, what does this ubiquitous wallet look like? What does that digital future look like? Secondly, under the intelligent experiences pillar is connected finance. So everybody's talking about open banking and how open banking is proliferating and how that's going to come together with changing regulation. But ultimately, what does that mean? So where are we going to land from a connected finance point of view if we think about connected finance as the next step post open banking? Number 5 is borderless rails. We've spoken about regulation. We know sovereignty is important for all of the markets that we operate in. That is especially true in sub-Saharan Africa. But there's also a need to promote and drive frictionless payment. So how do you balance regulation and what's happening within the regulatory space against what you need to accomplish to ensure that you've got a frictionless experience for the consumer and broader take-up in terms of the system? And lastly, acceptance. So we talked about the growth of traditional acceptance within South Africa, but the reality is that acceptance drives utility for the consumer at the end of the day. And without having a very articulate strategy, if you're looking at person to merchant or request to pay type of flows, if you don't have a very articulate and well-defined strategy around acceptance and understand how those models are going to translate in driving new use cases, then there's absolutely no utility for the consumer, and it will compromise the way the take-up is happening. And then lastly, from a sustainable futures perspective, it's understanding how do we think about inclusive credit, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then 2 aspects that almost goes hand in hand. The one is the conscious consumerism, which I speak about, the way that consumers are now exercising choice, and lastly, trust. I was just on the last one, and I actually wanted to close with this, but I wanted to say it now. On the embedded trust side, I was recently in Zimbabwe and had an opportunity to sit with some of the fintech companies over there and the financial services providers. And the first thing that they said is that from a digital perspective, what we sometimes forget in sub-Saharan Africa is that the addressable opportunity is massive because more than 90% of all transactions are still cash. But the reality is that if you don't solve for two fundamentals, one being trust and the second one being certainty, you have no hope of driving any digital transactions at all. And so it's a function of understanding how do we actually embed that trust and as an industry instill the type of trust and reliability and an ease of user experience that will drive adoption into those environments where cash has not been prevalent. So when we speak about reimagining money, I think, we always think in terms of currency. And so it's exchange of value between two individuals or between an individual and a business or a business to business. And we did so with currency, and that's fair comment, right? But if you think about it, none of us in the room would really be comfortable to just give away our loyalty points. So loyalty points in a sense is also currency because I can exchange that for value. And so then the argument goes is that if you start thinking about the exchange of value as something that has a level A credential or something that can be exchanged, it means that anything that has inherent value to it or some asset class that you can say value is attached to it should be able to be exchangeable. And so then at the back of that, if that is the mechanism around exchanging value, then how do we think about it? And the reality is we think around that in terms of tokenization. So from a card point of view, tokenization is done well with the digitization of the 16-digit PAN around how we think through making that credential available. And initially with the deployment of the X-Base, with Apple Pay and the introduction of Samsung Pay and so on, tokenization played a very fundamental role in the way that we thought through identification of the consumer, the pointing of the particular store of value, and then the making the transaction available within the different channels and form factors. But the reality is that tokenization could be much more than that. Tokenization has also been applied within the NFT space. So with the generation of non-fungible tokens and the allocation of valuable value to an NFT, that becomes a token in itself that can be exchanged. And so then the question mark goes, well, how does tokenization evolve beyond that? And the way that it evolves beyond that is that every single thing that you can articulate as an asset class, whether it's property, whether it's your car, whether it's clothes that's been signed by a celebrity, can be attached value. And once that value is attached, it can be tokenized. And against that tokenized world, then, it becomes a mechanism of how that multi-token network is going to be used interchangeably and how that's going to be used across the different environments. So there's a company in South Africa that has started tokenizing the value of your property. So they actually have tokenized properties. It's a company called Flit Properties. You can go and check them out. And I think that what's that's starting to show is that there's an evolution in the way that we think about tokenization that goes well beyond card, but that talks about the articulation of value that is attached to an asset class. And against that, value can be exchanged. And so the way that we think about that multi-token network is going to very fundamentally impact the way that we exchange value. Secondly, around programmable payments, I'm going to go a little bit quicker and I'll take some questions at the end. But from a programmable payments point of view, we always want to anchor, and the kind of conversations we're having at the moment within the business space is to say, well, we issue a certain amount of cards and we're focused on the segment and we're thinking about the way that we're going to drive utility and we want to get total purchase volume up and we talk about all of the indicators. And at the back of that, we then start talking about segments and we ask questions around how the retail world is going to shape and what are the fintechs going to do next and who's going to win between the telcos and the banks in terms of an articulation of the value story. But I think what we sometimes forget is that there's a fundamental truth around the way that payments are evolving in its own right. So yes, everything that I've said about the segments and embedding value and payments not being the primary monetization aspect of it is true. But what's also true is that payments itself is evolving. And it's going to do so in two very significant ways. If you think about across multi-rail in the debit space, everybody runs a debit order, or many people runs a debit order that for your utility payments at the end of the month. And we've all signed up for some streaming service that you pay by credit card, like a Spotify, for example. But the next click in that is additional complexity that comes into that space. And the way that comes together is really thinking about the application of AI, smart contracts, and API integrations into different or disparate third-party environments. And that then gives you the ability to come up with much more nuanced or complex use cases. And one of those use cases could be B2B payments from a supply chain management point of view. And think about that from a logistics perspective, where the whole payment process can be automated if a token was generated prior to the goods being dispatched, there being sensors at the point of delivery, and once that happens and certain conditions are fulfilled, and you know where that the goods has been delivered, the payment is automatically triggered. Another example could be in terms of marketplaces from a content creation point of view, where royalty payments and the payout of royalty payments can be done against the articulation of business rules that is applied within a certain space. And so the exchange of value then from a programmable payments point of view is not incumbent on somebody initiating the transaction, either from a push or pull perspective, but rather the conditions being articulated prior to the fulfillment of the transaction that then triggers the payment. And I think lastly then, in terms of this stream, is ubiquitous wallets. The only thing that I'd like to call out, just in the interest of time, is that wallets used to be one-dimensional. And we thought about wallets around being a single store of value that you're able to access that was tied into a single use case. And that has been largely true. But I think what's starting to happen is that the environments around which wallets are proliferating starts from that segments that we talked about a little bit earlier. And so if you think about in the past, where I have an opportunity to maybe have a mobile money wallet, or I've tokenized the card credential that I have available, that new environment then allows for all of the other non-financial information to also be captured in a very real way. So the way to make this real is to think about the way that an airline booking takes place today, an international airline booking. So you need to have your ID information and your basic personal information, but you also need to have your passport number. In South Africa's case, for the South African citizens, you probably need a visa as well. Then you need your payment credentials, and at the end of it, there's actually a lot of components that you need to pull together in order to facilitate and conclude an airline booking. So the way that ubiquitous wallets work and how that's translated in future is that all of those processes from a central data management point of view is regulated. And when you do the payment, it is not necessarily sharing that individual data points that would allow you to fulfill the transaction, but it's a more autonomous process that you would go through. And there's many examples within that space that's going to proliferate and grow. From an intelligent experiences perspective, I think that, for us, it's not so much about thinking in terms of things like the metaverse, for example, but it's rather around how the technology is going to come together and how, from a channel perspective, that is going to be availed. So, from a connected finance perspective, we talked a little about earlier what comes after open banking, and I think within that space, it's understanding, how do we create or make available the information that then can be leveraged within a third-party environment to provide new use cases and new solutions. And so I think within that environment, it's an understanding of the exchange of data between the financial institution and the financial service and the third-party services provider. One of these could be access to information that can be made available within a marketplace that would allow you credit in order to buy a certain good, or the availability of data that would make you ready to be able to apply for a loan or something like that. And within that environment, it then becomes a question around who's going to be the custodian of that data management. Are we looking at an era where data brokers will be introduced that will facilitate the exchange of data into environments that can then be used to provide personalized offers and experiences? And then lastly, within the intelligence experiences space is borderless rails. And I think the reality from a borderless rails perspective is that over the last 10 to 15 years or so, AI and machine learning has been very well articulated and used within the fraud in the back office environment. But I think that with the introduction of generative AI, that's going to move it's going to move forward and become part of the experience. And some of those experiences would not be the simple programming in the way that, we interact with chatbots, but those chatbots being able to actually understand exactly the state of your engagement with your financial institution or your bank and be able to answer complex questions within that environment. I think also important is an understanding around better wealth management as an example. So within the wealth management space, to be able on the fly from your banking app, get real-time information about an investment decision that might have crossed your path, and to be able to, amend and pivot and make the decisioning that you would need to do to make the right investment decision. And I think all of that needs to be anchored from a localization perspective on what is possible, not just in terms of payment regulation, but also in the way that we are thinking about data privacy. And it's those types of consideration that MasterCard thinks through when it engages with its partners. So for example, how do we think about a sub-Saharan African use case where we can apply a solution in multiple markets, 4 or 5 markets, and you need to have the ability to do rapid prototyping? And what is the role that generative AI can play in articulating a value story for those local markets that you can quickly test and learn, reapply the knowledge, and then ultimately deploy to scale? And I think that's what we mean with borderless rail and how that's going to come together. And then I think importantly and lastly, unleashing acceptance. I called out the data point around South Africa, but the reality around acceptance is just foundational to payments. And it doesn't really matter what rail you use. If you don't have the deployment around your acceptance network and the way that gets articulated and the way that evolves, there's no utility that can be provided for the consumer, and there won't be any take up around a new service or use case that you're providing, regardless of the rail that it runs on. And I think that the only question I'm going to call out here, because I do want to get to a Q&A a little bit, is I'll use one example, is that everything that we've done was a presentation around payments in the past. So from a traditional point of sale perspective, you would go and present your card to dip or to tap or to swipe, and more recently to tap your phone. But all of those was, in essence, really a merchant-initiated payment, if you think about it. It's the merchant's point of sale device, it's the merchant's infrastructure, and all that you provided was your credential to initiate that payment. And I think similarly, the way that e-commerce evolved was around check-in and the complexity around registration and doing all of that kind of thing. And I think that what e-commerce then evolved into is that checkout experience. And what we're going to see as the consumer experience evolves is not a payment or a checkout process, but rather a check-in process. And the example around that would be transaction authorization or customer authentication. It's the ability to walk into a shop and actually be recognized, with your permission, of course. But once you're recognized, all of your data could potentially be available. So it could be available with your credentials, your passport information, your visa information. If it's a medical environment, your health records. And against that backdrop, then you are checking in. And the way to go through that process, one of the initially fundamental use cases that we've already seen are with Amazon Go, for example, where you can actually walk in, pick the goods and services that you want, walk out of the store, and payment is facilitated. But I think in the context of South Africa, it's important to touch on the sustainable futures example. I'm going to come back to acceptance, but before I do that, Airtime Advance was introduced in South Africa through Vodacom. I think it's on that page over there as well. And I can't remember the year that it was introduced, but I do know now from a Vodacom point of view that almost half of the airtime is sold through Airtime Advanced. And if you think about the way that we think through sustainability and the way that we think through inclusion, in the past, it's always been against the strength of your credit record. But I think that we're entering a world where data can be leveraged in such a way to create a level playing field from consumers to small and micro enterprises, and the ability that transactional data or activity data is leveraged, overlaid with geographical data as an example, and used to introduce alternative scoring models. And the way that then comes together is to, at least at a principal level, start addressing some of the requirements that we would need that would allow micro enterprises to grow and not be stuck in the traditional mechanism around the way that we think about credit. And one of the things that we think deeply and seriously about is how do we make a difference within that environment to ensure that we do actually get to the point where these enterprises can be included as part of the broader economy. Last two parting thoughts before I open up for questions is then, against all of that, what does conscious consumerism use? Well, I think it is a recognition that from a corporate perspective, we need to be responsible and we need to think through the way that solutions are provided. But I think it's also important in order to drive our bottom lines. With, I think the data point there says it all, 76% of Gen Z consumers will abandon companies that they do not believe support the environment. I think there's also a data point that's not on the slide that says that there's a preference for supporting local entities that are solving for local problems as opposed to things that's very ambiguous and it is not directly tied into consumer need. And then lastly is that embedded trust that I talked about a bit earlier. And if I can bring this back to the acceptance point that I made a little bit earlier, the only way realistically to solve for the cash problem of 90% versus 10% electronic is not necessarily through the introduction of alternative rails. What it takes is an understanding of what are the pain points that we're actually solving for. Within a tokenized world, are there exchange of value that requires anonymity? And if we do require anonymity for some of the value that we exchange, and whether that's, it might be as simple as somebody wanting to use cannabis for medical purposes, but it's not regulated, and they wanted to do a cash transaction, but from a regulatory perspective, that's not allowed. Do we need to rethink the way that we think about regulation for the exchange of value for certain use cases? And if that is the way that we need to do it, how do we go about that? But also the trust and reliability aspect of it. So that's all I have today. I ran through it. I know that it's a lot, so very keen to take any questions for 4 minutes if there's any questions, which I will pick up here. Right, so top question here, which is a good one. How will the card payment ecosystem address the cost issue for more inclusivity? I think the cost issue needs to be unpacked. And the way that we certainly think about that is that in certain markets like East Africa, for example, in Kenya, we've dropped the acceptance rate that MasterCard charged by more than 50%. And the acceptance footprint for card then for person-to-merchant payments in East Africa is now well below M-Pesa transactions in Kenya. And so I think that it does become a function of the use case that you're talking about and the environment that you operate in. And I think that what's important is that we unpack on a use case basis what we're trying to solve for. Because in some instances, we don't necessarily need the full suite of payments. You don't necessarily need chargeback rights in the way that you would when you buy a television. And so the cost becomes a function of addressing the risk and also the use case and the environment that you're operating in. So the next question is, how is card relevant to fintechs in the new economy? I think to a certain extent that speaks for itself. If you think about the adoption of Apple Pay as an example, the underlying value store is still card. I think that the ubiquitous nature of cards even rings true in environments where card is not the predominant store of value. So in markets that's highly saturated, a lot of the use cases, specifically in the person-to-merchant payment space, still has the card rail as the underlying rail and card as the value store. But I'll give you a good example of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. Is most of the telcos, and thinking of the big three, if you think about companies like MTN and Airtel, they've gone back to associating card with the mobile money value store. And the reasoning behind it is that it's an access mechanism to the broader franchise globally. And so when you want to access things like subscription services for like Spotify and Amazon and Uber Eats, there's still a role to play within that space. And so I think that's the one easy short-term answer. I think the longer answer is probably that ultimately what we'll see is the different components of the transaction value chain being broken up. And so it might be that the rail in question is better utilized if you think about a non-card rail for the particular use case that you're interested in. But there might be a requirement around merchant authentication or channel enablement in an environment where the local rail don't support it, or consumer authentication in a way that makes sense. Or maybe it's a more complex use case like supplier payments, for example, where the way that that's stitched together necessitates the involvement of some of the components that's incumbent to card. UK. There's quite a controversial one which I want to answer, so I'll get to that one. But just a quick one to answer here. So how does South Africa deal with its significant infrastructure challenges in digital payments ecosystems? It's a great question. And I think that the answer to a certain extent is that we need to mobilize and leverage new technologies around being cloud native and the way that we think about leveraging global technologies but being able to scale it at local level. So to that end, MasterCard is in the process of deploying infrastructure in South Africa, and part of that infrastructure would mean that from a services perspective, we can make available a lot of the MasterCard assets on a bouquet basis that wouldn't necessarily have been there in the past. And so I think that the South African Reserve Bank showed the industry due north with its Vision 2025 paper in terms of where the country needs to get to. And I think that from a MasterCard perspective, we're committed to that journey, and happily to talk to anybody that has got use cases that require specific infrastructure where MasterCard could potentially play a role. And then I think there's a question here which I'll answer in 20 seconds, and then my time is unfortunately up. What's the risk of data being weaponized by big card companies? And I'd say that the risk is really low. And the reason that the risk is low is that the card companies do not keep personal, well, I don't know about everybody, but certainly MasterCard don't keep personal identifiable information, and information is kept in aggregate. So even today, and it's been true for the last 50 years, there is no personally identifiable information within the MasterCard network. The customer and the custodian of the customer relationship ultimately resides with the bank. So with that, my time's unfortunately up. Thank you very much for coming to the session. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Really appreciate it. Please feel free to exit, and remember there's a Electrum Stalikie with some lekker juice for you as well. And if you have any further questions for Gabriel, feel free to reach out to him privately.